The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and plastic. A sterile place meant for healing, but heavy with unspoken tension. I remember the way my father's hand trembled slightly as he reached for mine, his eyes filled with a gratefulness that looked foreign on his usually stoic face. "You saved my life," he whispered hoarsely, the weight of his words settling deep into my chest like a stone dropped into still water. I smiled, but I was too tired to reply. My body ached, raw and hollow, from the surgery. Yet inside I was warm with the sense of having done something right, something irreversible and sacred. It had been my idea. The doctors weren't even sure if I was a match, and when they confirmed I was, it felt like fate. My siblings were either too young, too unhealthy, or unwilling. My mother had already passed years before, and I was the only one left standing between my father and the dark shadow of death. There had never been a question in my mind. I volunteered without blinking, without letting my voice waver, even though my relationship with my father had always been complicated. He was not an affectionate man. He provided, he instructed, and he disciplined. Hugs were rare, compliments rarer still. But beneath his granite-like demeanor was a fragility he never showed to others. I caught glimpses of it in the way he lingered near the photo of my mother, in how he stood quietly by the window late at night after thinking everyone else was asleep. I wanted to believe that somewhere in that silence, he loved us, loved me. So I told myself the kidney would change something, not just his failing health, but our bond. That maybe, finally, I would matter to him not as a provider of obedience or as a background piece in his legacy, but as his daughter, his savior. Recovery was brutal. The pain was sharper than I expected, a hollowing sensation inside me that no medication could fully soften. I stayed in the hospital for 4 days longer than predicted. My father healed more quickly. He was praised for his resilience. I was patted on the shoulder and told I was brave in passing, like an afterthought. Still, I visited him in his room every morning, shuffling down the hall in my loose hospital gown, my feet dragging against the floor. He looked healthier already, skin less gray, eyes clearer. I didn't need his thanks. I needed his presence. I needed a word, a gesture, something that said, "You belong to me, and I see you now." When he was discharged before me, he didn't say goodbye. I watched from my hospital bed as my sister, who had been conveniently absent for most of the process, posted a smiling photo of them on Instagram. "Dad's back home, stronger than ever," the caption read. No mention of the surgery, no mention of me. Just a father and a daughter wrapped in each other's arms, a scene I had never known myself. At first, I told myself they were just being thoughtless. Social media isn't real life, I reasoned, but when I was finally home, my own apartment, not the family house, I waited for calls that never came. I texted updates on my condition, simple things like, "Finally walking without assistance," or, "Doctor says I should be okay to start part-time work soon." I got a single thumbs-up emoji from my brother, and nothing from my father. 3 weeks passed before I saw him again. I drove the hour-long trip to the family home, limping slightly still, my body not yet whole. The front door was locked when I arrived. I rang the bell, twice. No answer. I texted my brother, who told me they were just about to head out to dinner, and that I should have called first. My father never came to the door. Through the window, I saw him at the dining table, eating, laughing. When I confronted him a week later, after managing to get him on the phone, his voice was clipped, formal. "You did a good thing," he said, "and it was your choice. No one asked you to." I sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what he was implying. That my sacrifice had been unnecessary? That I had overstepped? "You gave me a kidney," not a contract," he added, and the line seared into my skin like a brand. I sat on my apartment floor for hours after that call, the phone still clutched in my hand, my mind playing his words over and over again like a cruel mantra. "You gave me a kidney, not a contract." It was like being gutted from the inside out, like someone had reached into the open space my surgery left behind and filled it with ash. I cried so hard I couldn't breathe, the kind of crying that makes no sound, just a deep shaking that starts in your bones and radiates outward until the whole world feels like it's crumbling. I didn't tell anyone, not at first. What could I say? That I had cut open my body, donated a part of myself to save a man who barely tolerated me, and now he was pretending I didn't exist? That my family, the people who posted prayer hands and miracles do happen on Facebook during the surgery, had erased me from their narrative the moment it was no longer convenient to remember I existed. I didn't want pity. I wanted answers. But they weren't coming. The silence became a new kind of wound, one I couldn't show to doctors or stitch up with gauze. My body healed. The incisions closed. I returned to work. But my heart was a slow, throbbing bruise that never stopped swelling. 2 months passed before I saw my father again, this time at a cousin's engagement party. It was crowded and loud, and I wasn't planning to go. But something inside me, maybe pride, maybe desperation, drove me there. I told myself it was just to show face, to remind them I was still standing, still alive, still the one who gave what no one else would. He saw me from across the room, our eyes locked for half a second. No nod, no smile. He looked away like I was a stranger. I stood in that room full of family and felt more alone than I ever had in my life. My aunt came up and hugged me tightly, whispering, "You look so much better now. Your dad is so lucky." I smiled politely. I didn't say a word. I didn't tell her he hadn't called me once. I didn't tell her he never said thank you. The anger came slowly, like a fog crawling through a forest, quiet but all-consuming. At first, I tried to smother it. I thought maybe if I was patient, if I just waited longer, he would come around. That he was just overwhelmed, scared, ashamed maybe. But one afternoon, after scrolling through my sister's Instagram, photos of my father holding her newborn baby, pictures from their family vacation to Lake Tahoe, birthday parties I wasn't invited to, I cracked. I threw my phone across the room. It didn't break, but something inside me did. I started writing everything down. Not for them, never for them, but for me. I needed to remind myself that I wasn't crazy, that what happened did happen, that I had given him something precious. I wrote about how he looked when the nurses wheeled him away for surgery, pale and shaking, too proud to cry but too scared to speak. I wrote about the moment I signed the consent forms, how my hands didn't tremble, how I didn't hesitate. I wrote about how my body screamed in protest afterward, how every movement felt like betrayal, and I wrote about the silence, how it grew heavier than the pain. My therapist, whom I started seeing shortly after, called it complicated grief. Not the kind that comes from death, but the kind that comes from betrayal, from abandonment, from watching someone you love walk away and pretend you were never there. I told her I felt like a ghost in my own family, that I had buried myself so someone else could live, and now I was haunting the edges of their world, uninvited. She told me to write a letter, not to send, just to write. So I did. In it, I told him everything. How I had waited for his love. How I thought this would finally be the thing that brought us together. How I had imagined, stupidly, that giving him a piece of my body would make me matter. That maybe he would look at me and not just see a daughter, but his daughter, someone worth holding on to. I didn't send it. I burned it. It felt like cremating the last bit of hope I had. And still, I missed him. I hated that I missed him. I hated that I checked my phone every holiday, every birthday, just in case he remembered, just in case the weight of what I did finally hit him. But the notifications never came. The silence stayed. Until one day, my brother called me out of nowhere. I hadn't spoken to him in over 6 months. He was casual, like we'd talked yesterday, like everything was normal. He asked if I was coming to Dad's retirement party. "What party?" I asked. There was a long pause. Then he muttered, "Oh, I thought you knew." I hung up before he could say anything else. I didn't need to hear the excuses. I didn't need another reminder that I'd been written out, that I was a chapter they'd closed. The night of the retirement party, I sat alone in my apartment, the lights off, the TV on mute, just watching shadows stretch across the room as the sun went down. I imagined the party in full color, balloons, speeches, champagne glasses clinking, stories being told, laughter echoing off the walls. I imagined my father at the center of it all, healthier than he had been in years, smiling, proud. I imagined him standing beside my sister, my brother, maybe even holding his grandchild in one arm, while shaking hands with old colleagues. I imagined a toast, a speech. Maybe someone would say, "None of this would have been possible without his daughter." But I knew they wouldn't. I wasn't part of the story anymore. I thought about driving over, thought about crashing it, just to stand there in the doorway and force them to look me in the eye, to see the face of the woman who bled for their celebration. But I didn't. Because I wasn't a ghost. I was a person, and I deserved more than scraps of acknowledgement. Still, as the night dragged on, I stared at my phone. I kept waiting for it to light up. Just one message, just one. "Wish you were here." It never came. 2 weeks later, I received a letter. An actual letter, not a text, not a call. It was from my father. The handwriting was careful, almost too neat, like he had rewritten it a dozen times. It started with my name. Not sweetheart, not my daughter, just my name, like I was a stranger receiving a business letter. He wrote that he hoped I was well, that he was writing to clarify a few things. He said he understood that I was upset, but that he didn't want the kidney to become a point of leverage between us. He said he felt I had made a noble choice, but that he didn't want it to define our relationship, or be held over his head like a favor owed. And then the final paragraph. "You have always been independent. I know you've felt distance between us, but perhaps that distance was necessary. I believe families must move forward, not dwell in sacrifice. I will always appreciate what you did, but I hope you can let go now." I read it over and over. At first, I felt numb. Then, sick. He had taken the deepest wound I carried and reframed it as my own fault. My need for connection, my need to be seen, he painted it as manipulation. As if my grief, my loneliness, my quiet desperation for love was some tool I had been using to make him feel guilty. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the paper in half. I wanted to scream into the void that I had given him my kidney. Not a painting, not a loan, not a ride to the airport. A piece of my body. And still, somehow he had managed to make me the problem. But beneath the rage, there was a quiet truth that finally broke through. He didn't know how to love me. Maybe he never had. I didn't respond. I couldn't. What was there left to say to a man who saw my devotion as debt collection? In the months that followed, I began to rebuild. Not physically, that healing was already done, but emotionally. I stopped checking their social media. I muted their numbers. I stopped sending updates, stopped asking to be invited. I carved space in my life for people who chose me, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And slowly, painfully, I found peace in the absence. I volunteered at a patient support center for organ donors. I met people who had walked through the same fire, some with grateful recipients, others with stories like mine, filled with silence and loss. We shared our pain in quiet circles, our victories in soft smiles. I met one woman, older than me, who had given her liver to her sister and never heard from her again. She told me, "I gave it to her because I could, not because I expected anything back. But that doesn't mean it didn't hurt." I cried in front of strangers that day. I let the grief pour out in a way I never had before, because finally someone understood. And slowly, my sense of self stopped orbiting the black hole my father had left behind. Still, every once in a while when I lie in bed and the night is too quiet, I feel it again. The phantom ache of something missing. Not the kidney, but the idea of him. The version of him I had created in my head. The father who would thank me, hold me, tell me I meant something. But that father never existed. Not really. And it took losing part of myself to finally see it. A year passed, then another. People stopped asking about him. The friends who had once offered hesitant condolences. "I'm sure he'll come around," or "maybe he's just processing it all," eventually fell silent too. Because there was no new development, no reunion, no healing arc to report. Just the dull persistence of absence, like a scar that never fades, only dulls with time. I moved to a new apartment across the city. I painted the walls with color. I hung pictures of my travels, my dog, my friends, everything that was mine, wholly and without condition. My life began to look like it belonged to someone else, someone stronger, someone freer. And maybe it did. There were still moments that made the wound throb unexpectedly. Seeing a father and daughter at the park, hearing a man talk about walking his daughter down the aisle, watching a movie where the protagonist risked everything to save his child, and actually said it, actually showed it. Love, raw and open. I wondered sometimes what it would have been like to have that, to know it. But I never allowed myself to dwell for long. One summer afternoon, I received a message through the organ donation network I had joined, one I sometimes spoke for, offering words to new donors about what to expect, how to prepare, how to heal. The message was from a young woman preparing to donate her kidney to her mother. She had written, "I'm scared, not of the surgery, but of everything after. What if it changes nothing? What if it makes things worse?" I sat with that question. For a long time, I thought about what I wish someone had said to me before I laid down on that operating table and offered up a piece of myself to a man I wanted so badly to love me. Finally, I wrote back, "You cannot control how someone receives a gift. You can only control the grace with which you give it. And sometimes giving isn't about them at all. It's about knowing who you are when everything else falls away." She never replied. Maybe she didn't need to. Maybe she just needed someone to say it out loud. That fall, I went back to the hospital. Not for another surgery, but to speak at a donor appreciation ceremony. I stood on the small stage, under the pale glow of fluorescence, and told my story. Not just the loss, not just the betrayal, but the clarity that followed. Told them how I had given my father my kidney believing it would draw us closer, and how it had instead torn us apart. How it had forced me to confront the truth of our bond, or the lack of it, and how, despite all of it, I didn't regret my choice. Because even though he turned away, I didn't. I stood by what I gave. I stood by who I was when I gave it. There were tears in the audience. Some were mine. After the event, an elderly woman came up to me with shaking hands and said, "You're the bravest kind of broken. The kind that glows, I will never forget that. Years later, my father's health began to fail again. Not kidney-related, but something else. My sister emailed me about it, asking if I wanted to come. I stared at her words for a long time. Come. Like I was still part of it. Like I hadn't been locked out. Like the door had never been slammed shut. But I didn't go. I didn't write back. Because there's a line between forgiveness and self-erasure. And I had already crossed it once. I had already poured too much of myself into silence. I had already let the hunger for love turn into a kind of self-destruction. I made peace with loving someone who could not love me back. That was the real surgery, the deeper cut. And the real healing? That was choosing myself. Every day after. Even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. Because now, when I look in the mirror, I see a woman who gave everything. Not for thanks. Not for praise. But because she could. And that kind of love, I've learned, is never wasted. Even when it's unreturned. Even when it vanishes into silence. Because it leaves behind something stronger than gratitude. It leaves behind you.